You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. When I talk to people about the really big rewilding projects, I'm usually talking to conservationists in Africa. When asked to describe their vision of big, wild places with large herds and iconic carnivores, people often describe large parks in African countries. But there's a really big rewilding project happening right here in the lower 48 states of America. And that's what I'm excited to discuss with Dr. Daniel Kinka from American Prairie Reserve, a planned 3.2 million acre network of private and public lands in northeastern Montana, a very large chunk of the northern Great Plains. Daniel is American Prairie Reserve's wildlife restoration manager, and his primary responsibilities include restoring and monitoring wildlife on the reserve and managing the wildlife-friendly ranching program, Wild Sky. He also acts as a liaison to scientists conducting research at American Prairie. He joined American Prairie in 2018, shortly after completing his doctoral degree in ecology at Utah State University.
American Prairie Reserve's mission is to create the largest wildlife refuge in the continental United States, in the lower 48. And that will be a refuge for both people and wildlife or biodiversity, managed in perpetuity for the benefit of people and wildlife. Where we work, this area of the northern Great Plains in central Montana, is part of what we call the Northern Great Plains ecosystem that kind of goes from Montana and spans the border into Canada and touches on Alberta and Saskatchewan. The northern part of the Great Plains that stretch the entire continent of North America. And the reason why we work there is grasslands, temperate grasslands, savannas, prairies, these are similar terms, are the least protected biome on the planet. So there's less than 5% protection for these places. And we can get into what that protection means, but basically, particularly in North America, particularly in the United States, we did a decent job protecting from development the areas of, pristine, quote unquote, pristine natural beauty, things like mountains and geysers and canyons, that sort of thing. We didn't have a lot of focus on, I think, biodiversity, particularly the large mammalian biodiversity that was kind of, in my mind, as an ecologist, part of the gem of the continent, right? Your bison and your elk and your bighorn sheep and your grizzly bears and your wolves, all the way down to prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, that sort of thing. There was calls for that in the early 1800s by some of the early kind of white settlers, but it just never came to be. And that story of North America, writ large across the globe, looks very, very similar. Grasslands, as it turns out, are places where people like to live and have lived for a very long time. The wetter ones, wetter than we are, make pretty productive farmland. And the drier ones, more like we are seen as kind of productive rangelands throughout the whole world. And so probably as a result of that and a couple other things, we haven't done a very good job protecting them. We lose prairie grassland habitat. It's more imperiled than things like coral reefs, things like rainforests that we hear a lot more about. And in fact, so much so that early studies found that there's really only 4 temperate grasslands on this planet that are large enough and intact enough to even warrant serious considerations for ecosystem level protections, ecosystem level conservation. Those are the Kazakh steppe, the Mongolian steppe, the Patagonian steppe, and the Northern Great Plains, which I mentioned at the top. And so American Prairie Reserve's mission is to help conserve some of that biodiversity, some of that wildness, that it still exists and can exist again in a very close to wild state in the near future, right in the middle of the Northern Great Plains in central Montana.
No small task, but what an important one. It's like being a museum curator and handling the most priceless, unique, individual things known to humankind.
In other ways, it's complicated. You mentioned, feeling in some way responsible or assigning yourself the task of being some kind of custodian or like a curator of a place. And I think that's absolutely accurate. But imagine like that natural history museum or whatever metaphor you want, post-earthquake. So the job is like everything's on the floor, and you recognize the importance of all of those components, but you got to put them back the way they were. And there's very little left to tell you kind of what the best way to do that is. You have an image in your mind of what it looked like, pre-earthquake or pre-disaster. But there's not a lot. We have a lot of good science in rewilding. I don't want to gloss over that. But there's still so much left to understand, questions we just don't know the answer to about what the best way to kind of rebuild the thing is. That's the kind of challenge that I like to deal with. And to the extent that I can speak for my colleagues, I think we all like to do that. But man, what a task, right? Because you recognize the monumental importance of it, both, anthropologically, sociologically, ecologically, and recognize the weight of that task that we've set out for ourselves, and yet still need to find a way to do it without guidelines. But it's a daunting task sometimes.
How much do you have to let nature tell you the things you don't know? But isn't there some place in there that you have to step back and put your hands on your hips and go, well, I mean, the rest now is up to nature, and I can't wait to see what she does, because I have no idea where we go from here.
There's an Aldo Leopold quote, I think, right? One of many, right? This idea that like the first rule of any kind of intelligent tinkering is to like retain all the parts and pieces. I'm paraphrasing, something like that, right? And I think you kind of speak to that, and I definitely think that fits into the kind of the Prairie Reserve model, the thesis that we operate under, which is the first step is to just put all the ingredients back there, right?
Yeah.
You need the biodiversity to support the resilience of the place, so that those natural processes that we know are important can take hold again. And so we think about things like, ecosystem engineers, the keystone species that build and preserve this kind of heterogeneity and diversity on the landscape that we know in turn supports greater levels of biodiversity, which in turn supports greater levels of resilience. And so the prairies have always been this place that's kind of has an enormous amount of stochasticity in the natural system, right? Like it gets extremely cold, it gets extremely hot, it can have droughts that last for decades. Typically, you would have had wildfires burning, grazing at an incredible scale by wild ungulates that looks almost chaotic at some point, right? And all of those kind of chaotic or stochastic features combined to create a very, very variable landscape, but in an interesting, like almost ironic way. I think it's that heterogeneity that promotes the resilience, right? The heterogeneity gives space for all these different ecological niches for different parts of biodiversity to fill. And then of course that biodiversity leads to a resilience. So when you talk about kind of the rewilding process, I think you're right. I think the first thing that we need to do is acquire the land base, right? You need some kind of security, and it's got to be big, because I just mentioned prairie ecosystems work on large level scales, right? Historically, part of it would have burned, part of it would have flooded. Grazing ungulates need somewhere to go to get away from that. And in the process of grazing, they're creating these other habitats. So APR needs to be, we think, scientists tell us, about 3.2 million acres. So that's the size of Yellowstone National Park and Glacier National Park combined, about the size of the state of Connecticut. And you need a land base that's truly that big to even think about having an ecologically meaningful prairie, an ecologically functioning, fully functioning ecological prairie ecosystem, right? And then in addition to that, the next step is the rewilding, right? How do we put all of those pieces back together? And then I think, to your point, Jack, although we've got a little ways to go before we get there, is to then kind of stand back and take a look and say, okay, we've got all the pieces are back together. That pocket watch is kind of reassembled in the way that the best way that we can think that it fits together. Maybe now we take a step back and we say, we got to have a little bit of faith that these processes, these interactions will function again the way they were supposed to, and have a kind of a careful and a light touch to guide things to maintain that biodiversity and that resilience within the system.
2 housekeeping notes here. Lest anyone begin to yawn when we say the word prairie. I want everybody right now not to leave this podcast wherever you're listening to it, but open up a browser and go to americanprairie.org and disabuse yourselves of any idea that you may have of what a prairie ecosystem looks like, because you're about to see some of the most beautiful stuff you've ever seen if you haven't really taken a look at this part of the world. I'm sitting here looking at it thinking, why do so many people go to Africa to experience the wide open David Attenborough kind of, I mean, it's beautiful and I don't want to put anybody down. I have lots of friends in Africa, many of whom have been on this show. But if you didn't want to make that trip, and I know they're not the same exactly ecosystems or anything like that, but my goodness, I get that feeling that you don't typically get when you look at American wide open spaces that are typically very mountainous. What we protect is typically rocks and ice, and that's what always gets the attention. That's another reason I wanted to talk to you, and do anything I can to build up your guys' work in any way that's possible, because this is not the kind of place that everybody's used to when we talk about things on this show. Typically, or when you get a brochure or a newsletter in the mail from your favorite conservation organization, they're going to have an eagle flying over a mountain, ponderosa pines, forest, and all of that kind of stuff, but typically not this. And so I really want to make sure that people know. And the other thing is, of that 3.2 million acres, you're around 420,000 with federal and private lands. So that's not so bad. I mean, that's a really big chunk.
It's already bigger than Grand Teton National Park. I mean, we're on the way, right? And then you think about the American Prairie Project that 3.2 million acres is intended to include a bunch of public lands, right? In fact, the vast majority of it will be public land that already exists as public land. APR just needs to kind of like glue it together, right? Like you piece together some of the deeded parcels, and they are few in that part of the country that kind of could hold those public lands together as a kind of unified whole, a unified kind of rewilding project, a place for nature. But yeah, we've got about 100,000 deeded acres, land that we own outright right now, plus another 300 or so leased acres, so primarily BLM, Bureau of Land Management land that we have the grazing leases for, and a little bit of DNRC or Montana state lands that we have grazing leases for as well. And so that's the 420,000 acres that you mentioned. You add that to the 1.1 million acres of the Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge, around which APR is being built. And you have something close to like almost 1.5 million acres that is in one way or another set aside for wildlife, or put another way, set aside for biodiversity, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the goal. So yeah, we're a little less than halfway to the goal, even including the CMR. So we have quite a bit of ways to go, and there's other kind of intricacies beyond just the land model that need to be addressed. But yeah, it's a place that people can visit now, and there's quite a bit of it to visit, actually. So yeah, the mission 20 years on, and we just celebrated our 20th anniversary, is well underway. It's not just a pipe dream at this point. There's quite a bit of land that's already being managed for this biodiversity management, as opposed to kind of commodity production, which would have been the former state of those lands.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Did you know we also publish insightful and inspirational content from leading rewilding scholars, poets, artists, and organizers from around the world? You can visit rewilding.org and sign up for our weekly digest to receive brilliant, fresh insights on everything rewilding. You'll find over a decade of articles and news from the front lines of wildlands protection and all kinds of restoration efforts. Check us out at rewilding.org, and don't forget to share it with friends. I can't think of a better example of a real-life version of the ABCs of rewilding, in terms of connectivity, using, leveraged private lands to buffer and connect the larger chunks of public lands. How big is your staff in the summers? I imagine it balloons quite a bit with all the studies that you do and all the help that you need doing those studies.
Yeah, maybe not as big as you would think, considering the size that the reserve already is. We have about 30 full-time staff, and that can balloon to up to around 45, 50, including temporary staff to come in the summer. And that's just people that, wear the APR, wear the American Prairie name tag, right? Mm-hmm. But that doesn't include, we don't do science in-house as an institution, knowing that kind of we have a different responsibility, a different mission that we've set out to actually kind of use the best available science to do it. But we need to keep generating that science. And so we do that through partnerships, primarily now with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, but also with a number of universities, both local in Montana and then throughout the United States as well. So we've got graduate students and postdocs and Smithsonian researchers and some agency folks as well. And none of those people kind of, quote unquote, wear the American Prairie hat. They're not on the payroll, so to speak. But if you include those people, yes, there's quite a number of people now. And I keep trying to grow that actually to get more people, more scientists, more researchers come to this place, because the more we know about it, the more attention it attracts, right? People think of Yellowstone now not as just the first national park, but as kind of a research laboratory. I would love to have people think of American Prairie the same way, but then also to help inform us. Science and management is a two-way street, right? We can work directly with these scientists, some of the best scientists in the world, to tell them these are the things that we need to know. We think we need to know as managers to do a better job of rewilding, conserving this place. Can you help us figure this out? And they say, absolutely. And by the way, have you thought about X, Y, and Z? And we say, no, because that's not our role, right? We're busy with shovels and backhoes and going to public meetings and thinking about social carrying capacity, and maybe we missed something, and the scientists will say, well, I think this is a really important point, Danny, whoever, that you're missing. Can we do this? Can we look at the interactions of pollinator communities and how that mixes with a bison herd, et cetera, et cetera.
What are some of the cool things that have been discovered as a result of any of the studies, any of the number that you could pull from?
There's some really interesting findings. I think one of the primary ones being kind of the difference between bison and cattle and how they operate as grazers. Now, European domesticated cattle can be substituted in many ways for a wild ungulate, can kind of serve as a proxy for a bison, the indigenous grazer on the continent. It takes careful management, and thankfully there are some ranchers out there that are doing these really cool, novel, progressive. I know that term can be pejorative in certain circles, but I mean that as a compliment, doing these things that mimic nature. And isn't that cool? Because there's always going to be, well, in my lifetime, there will always be more cows than bison in North America. And so to the extent that we can make the cows act like bison, isn't that great for the ecosystem and for biodiversity? But in addition to that, we've had some graduate student projects, some science that's come out and looked and said, these animals are, while cattle can do a decent job mimicking this, there's some stuff that cattle just won't do. You can't teach a cow to wallow like a bison does, which is kind of the way they roll around in the dirt. They do this for a number of reasons, probably to shed ectoparasites, like fleas, ticks, stuff like that, irritants, mosquitoes. They roll around. The bulls also do it closer to the breeding season. They kind of pee in a hole, roll around in it, make themselves big and sticky and stinky. Apparently this attracts the lady bison. This is a breakdown between human and bison understandings of how mating rituals work, but apparently it works for them. So you get these persistent kind of holes on the landscape, right? These wallows, these depressions. You can't teach a cow to do that, but we're learning more and more that these things are really important for kind of this low, not low level, but smaller, like a microscopic biodiversity, right? Not always exclusively microscopic, but small things, right? Depend on these wallows. All kinds of invertebrates, insects are using these as little ephemeral wetlands because these wallows collect water. The grassland communities that grow in a halo around these things actually seem to have a different kind of species composition than you see in the rest of the grasslands combined. And so there's features like that you're like, wow, well, if we, what does that mean for the dung beetles and certain, ground nesting bees and stuff that haven't had access to these things for 100, 120 years, 150 years more in some cases, right? Because cows just don't do this. And what does that mean for the ecosystem at kind of a lower, a foundational level? We also know and learned from studies that went on in the Prairie Reserve that, bison will go significantly farther from a water source naturally to graze. Cows don't do this. Now, that is something that can be mimicked, right? A cattle producer, if they're doing their job, to the best of their ability, using the best available science, can say, okay, well, the cows aren't going to go that far from the water, but I need to get them to graze farther into the pasture. I'll use salt blocks or create different water sources. They've been doing this for a long time, but bison just do this on their own. So now we see, oh, cool, this indigenous grazer to North America is evolved, maybe not surprisingly, to graze these landscapes in the way that is most beneficial to the landscape itself. What else? There's another story that I really like. A researcher that we work with, Sam Fuhlendorf, has got at a little bit of this, not just at American Prairie Reserve, the Charlie Russell Refuge, but also back in his home country in Oklahoma, where he's studying fire effects. He does a lot of kind of pyrrhic herbivory, so how wildfire or fire interacts with these large grazers. And it's just one of my favorite stories. Through some of his research and the research of others, they found that fire return cycles on the prairie, given the kind of chemical features of the landscape, the amount of grass that's produced. You don't get a lot of rainfall there. We're talking about a region that gets like 13 inches of rainfall on average or something like that. This is the short grass prairie. It's not as lush as the prairies that would have existed farther to our east. So the fire return cycle is not actually predicted to be that high because, the soils and the rainfall don't support a lot of, mass buildup of grass. We don't think. If we take soil core samples and we actually say, well, what was the actual fire return cycle, pre contact, right? Like, or like, pre Lewis and Clark, right? Prior to 1800. Do we see fire return cycles based on where the kind of ash builds up in the core samples? Is it returning at the same rate as predicted, which is, I don't know, once a generation or something like that? And the answer is actually no. It came back much more frequently. Fire return cycles on the prairie where we are seem to be closer to like 4 or 5 years. And the only explanation for that is indigenous peoples, the human beings that populated the North American continent for at least 13,000 years, were driving these fire return cycles faster than they would have happened otherwise. And probably for a number of reasons, right? We know that after fire, the grazers are attracted back. So they can use this as a way to kind of either bring game back or drive game to other places, maybe as a tactic of war. They can use it to green things. There's just a lot of reasons why you would do this. But the point is, this is a human ecosystem. Like, people have been a fundamental, not just a nominal, but a fundamental, like a functioning part, a kind of a keystone species in this ecosystem forever, for as long as there's been kind of modern people, right? And isn't that neat? Because I just think that really speaks to these new ideas of ecology that aren't, I don't believe in wilderness, but I believe in wildness, right? And this is a concept that includes people now as opposed to excluding them. And so I'm really interested in science that can tell us more about what the role of people was in these ecosystems, right? A lot of times mountains were only visited temporarily by peoples. It's really tough to live above 10,000 feet in the winter in the Rocky Mountains, but these prairie landscapes were probably continuously inhabited. And I think we really have to, if we're doing our jobs properly, think about how those are human ecosystems and have always been human ecosystems if we're going to do our job right to kind of rewild the place.
That we've ever demonstrated an ability to be a lot more in line with our surroundings is heartening. Right. Yes. I mean, it's not a bleak message for people who are like, yeah, but we need places that just are for nature. Well, yeah, of course. Sure, we do. That's just ethically, if not biologically, the right thing. But when you're talking about grand scales where you can't avoid human habitation and you still have to have some sort of a solution that works for all involved. I mean, that's possible, right? Even in the modern era, like what would have to change that we're doing now that would bring it as closely in line with something that's of a nominal existence? Everybody's doing all right. Everything's pretty well balanced.
The idea is, again, going back to this idea of kind of putting the pieces together, right? I think we can, Jack, and I think we should think about human ecologies more going forward, and not this idea of kind of walled Edens. This is not, I'm not criticizing anybody for doing the conservation work that's vitally important across the globe, but I think particularly for where we are, there's so much that we can learn from like the continuous habitation of the plains for, the last 13 to 15,000 years, which in terms of ecological rewilding is the only time frame that we really care about, right? A lot before that, you go into the Pleistocene, you've got all kinds of wildlife, particularly mammals, like big giant stuff, none of which walks the earth anymore, right? American Prairie is not a Pleistocene rewilding project. It doesn't have to be, because all of the biodiversity that has existed for the last 13,000 years or so still exists, even if it doesn't exist on the plains, right? There weren't any bison on the place where American Prairie Reserve sits until 15 years ago. Since for 150 years, there hadn't been until 15 years ago, right? Rewilded species. Fort Belknap Indian Reservation are close partners and close neighbors that are right across the highway from us. They reintroduced bison in the 70s, so they're ahead of us, and we have a lot to learn from those kind of indigenous rewilding efforts as well, kind of mimicking those to the extent that we can. But these are species that are brought back, right? The swift fox. We're undergoing a project with Smithsonian and Fort Belknap Indian community right now that's reintroducing swift fox, right? They exist north of us and they exist south of us. They've been kind of locally extinct, extirpated in the region. We're undergoing a rewilding project right now to reintroduce this species back to the plains, the endemic fox species of the plains. It's like the size of a house cat. It's a very it's not scary. It's easy wildlife to think about rewilding, right? They eat like bugs and prairie dogs. So they were killed off on accident as a byproduct of poisoning and trapping for things like wolves and coyotes. Nobody really had a problem with them to begin with. So this is a species we can bring back, even though it's absent, but it exists. But these are positive rewilding stories, right? Same thing with black-footed ferrets. They're difficult to rewild because we need more prairie dogs, and there's just too few prairie dogs, and prairie dogs still remain unprotected. You can shoot and kill them with, you don't need a tag. There's no licensing involved in that in the state of Montana. They're also extremely susceptible to the sylvatic plague, which is a non-native disease that made its way to North America, again, accidentally, but the huge impact on prairie dog populations. So ferrets only eat prairie dogs for the most part. If you want ferrets, you got to have a lot of prairie dogs. And so another kind of like almost accidentally extirpated species that we're working really hard to kind of rewild. What's the plan look like for that? But the point is, whether, ferrets, swift foxes, wolves, grizzly bears, and previously bison, some of the only species that were kind of missing from the ecosystem. But one thing you'll notice about all 5 of those is that they do exist. None of these species are extinct on the planet. They're just extirpated from the region. And so one of the things I think is most hopeful about American Prairie is we don't have to consider de-extinction. We don't have to think about like novel trophic rewilding where we're bringing in some weird species from South America to fill a niche space of an extinct North American species. We don't have to do all of that, right? The previous wild state of the prairie was like 150 years ago. And I use the term wild to mean like biodiverse, complete from a biodiversity perspective. People and all the wildlife that would have called the place home for the last, 13,000 years or so. And ecosystems are dynamic. Populations fluctuate. That's normal. That's part of ecology, right? But everything was there. That's very close. 150 years ago isn't that long ago. I feel my colleagues that are working in places of Europe, their previous wild states are like thousands of years, 8,000 years ago, right? And they have to think about, how do you rebuild an ecosystem when just so much of it is just gone? And I think
they're talking about surrogates too. All the time they're talking about surrogates for animals that don't exist anymore.
Exactly. That's right. And again, I'm not criticizing. I'm thankful that we don't have, they have to, but we don't, which I think is one of the reasons that makes American Prairie so compelling. Is it's just like, we're so close to this, right? Like it's tragic that we lost it, but it is rebuildable.
I think after condors and how hard that was, Mexican wolves, how hard that was with this tiny original population. So that's why everybody that hears about you is rooting so hard for American Prairie. Most people, when they hear about it, they never even imagined something like this exists.
If I'm talking to a 4th grade class, right, and I say, close your eyes and imagine the, African Serengeti, like, what do you see? You don't have to have ever been to the Serengeti. Like all you've got to see is one Attenborough nature documentary, right? To see like the wildebeests and the giraffes and all that stuff, and lions and stuff. It's very easy to picture. Almost anybody anywhere in the world, I think, can do this. If I ask that same 4th grade class, now close your eyes and you imagine an American prairie. Imagine the northern Great Plains. What do you see? I'm very, very lucky if I ever hear anything besides cows, a fence, little house on the prairie, some kind of homestead, maybe a red barn. Like it's very, very difficult for people to conjure images of bison and Native American peoples and wolves and grizzly bears and bighorn sheep and elk and pronghorn and deer and black-footed ferrets and swift fox and prairie dogs from horizon and all these things that were there very, very recently and are not anymore. Rewilding is so much more difficult when we don't even have a cultural memory of what the place used to look like. We've got thousands of years of native oral tradition that tells us this is the case, but we've also got the accounts of people like Lewis and Clark. You've got all the paintings of Charlie Russell. You've got the paintings of George Catlin. You've got the writings of Audubon. All these people, not that long ago, were talking about how incredible this place is. We need to preserve this biodiversity, but we undid it so quickly that I don't think, at least amongst the, European descendants in North America, have a memory of what that place looked like. And it's very difficult to get people on board with rewilding if you can't get them to imagine a wild American prairie. And so many days, most days, I feel that this is my job, right? How do I paint that picture? How can I describe what Charlie Russell painted, right? In a way that gets people excited about biodiversity. This is a part of our, natural heritage that can exist again and existed very recently. It's doable to build that back and live, modern, productive human lifestyles alongside that in a way that's good for everybody, humans and wildlife, and does not have to come at a cost for anybody, people or wildlife. You asked a question about connectivity, and I think I've mentioned a couple times that American Prairie needs to be big, right? Like it needs to be big to accommodate for stochasticity, variability in the ecosystem. Bison need a lot of space to roam, especially if you're talking about a herd of thousands, not just 100 or a dozen bison or something like that. They need space to do the ecological work that they do. In terms of rewilding, right, which we haven't talked a lot about how we do that, you need connectivity, right? Bison, Montana's weird in the sense that even though bison are a national mammal, they're considered livestock in the state of Montana, which means we can buy them. We can buy them and we can graze them the same way our neighbors graze cattle, and they are under the jurisdiction of the Department of Livestock, not the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, right? So rewilding there looks easy. We got to follow the rules that any other agricultural producer follows, but we own the bison. For everything else, we're not a wildlife agency. And I don't think we should be. And so we have to think about other creative ways to do rewilding. Now, you can do that like Smithsonian did it with Swift Fox, operating with a sovereign nation that is the Fort Belknap Indian community, to say, okay, we have to think very deliberately about how we design a rewilding product. Or we're going to pick these things up from Colorado and Wyoming. We're going to transport them across the border. Mountains apart paperwork, right? But it's doable. I know, Jack, you worked on some of the wolf recovery stuff early on. Those are species that we can't reintroduce. And I don't think there's very much palatability for people to think about a hard reintroduction of something like a wolf or a grizzly bear. Just look at the legislation that's passed in Montana and Idaho over the last year, right? Like, it's biologists who I have an enormous amount of respect for, like heroes of mine who are about to retire because 20 years later, we do a good job, right? There's wolves in North America again, in the lower 48, in the Rocky Mountains, in Yellowstone, in central Idaho. Life's career, we did it. Good job. I'm out. Good luck, next generation, right? And then with the stroke of a pen, legislatures can undo that, right? And I'm not criticizing my predecessors, but it's like hard reintroductions. This is something they're going to be subject to. Instead, what I think you see happening at American Prairie is wolves migrating north primarily from the Yellowstone ecosystem, and grizzly bears migrating eastward from the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, and kind of auto rewilding, basically. Their habitats are filling up. Natural carrying capacity seem to be high. And so we see what any ecologist would tell you that they should predict is these dispersing animals looking for new habitat. And both species seem to be looking towards the prairies, their native homes, right? Remember, Lewis and Clark saw way more wolves and grizzly bears in the plains than they did in the mountains. It's understandable that they're following these river corridors back to central Montana, back to the Fort Peck Reservoir, back to the Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge. And so rewilding then is not dudes in helicopters and trucks moving wildlife around. It's saying, oh man, through all of this good work of conservation and a little bit of public tolerance, we see wildlife rewilding themselves in some cases. What can we do to make that sticky? How can I work with the neighboring communities to say, there are people that live with these large carnivores. We know there's a way to do this safely, securely, in a way that's to the benefit of the wildlife and the people. Can we start building those things into the system now, as opposed to later when they get here? That's what rewilding looks like. I think in a lot of North America now is social carrying capacity. How do you work with people to think about telling stories about what a wild northern Great Plains used to look like, and promoting tolerance for living alongside wildlife so that we can have wildness again without having to create some kind of walled Eden or wilderness that's where we say the animals go here and the people go here and they can't mix. That, I think that's what rewilding looks like in a modern context. American Prairie Reserve is open 365 days a year. There's no price of admission. We want people to come and enjoy and see this, right? To my point, Jack, about getting people to remember culture, that restore that cultural memory, part of that comes from being able to visit, because when you visit, you create a connection to the place. And when you create a connection to the place, you have the ability to love and protect the place.
Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time. It was so great to finally connect with you and the organization.
My pleasure, Jack. Thank you for having me. Thank you for highlighting American Prairie Reserve. I'm happy to come back anytime that you'd like. And thanks to the listeners for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.